Hi, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I am Flory Wilson, the founder of Gender Ideal, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Ankur Kumar. We're going to have a great conversation. This is the fifth session in our LinkedIn Live series. The purpose of this series is to explore the concepts that are covered in the Ideal 12 assessment, which is a tool that Gender Ideal launched in March of 2022. And that's designed to be a first step for companies to benchmark their performance on 12 core practices that have an impact on gender equity in the workplace. We want you to walk away from this conversation with the insight you need to be an advocate inside of your organization on why and how to begin implementation of these practices. Links to this video and additional resources are available on our website, and they can be found under the Resources tab. We encourage everyone on this call or watching the video to participate in the Ideal 12 campaign on behalf of your organization. And when you submit your assessment, you'll receive a score out of 12 possible points, access to a benchmark report so you can understand your performance, and to take action on those 12 practices to commit to improving. You can learn more about this on our website, www.gender-ideal.org. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today with Ankur. She is a leader of McKinsey's diversity, equity, and inclusion work, helping organizations across sectors move the needle on this business imperative. She helped to launch and continues to lead McKinsey's Connected Leaders Academy, one of the firm's commitments to equity and access that provides leaders a catalyst for growth through distinct identity-based programs for Black, Hispanic, Latino, and Asian leaders. Since launching in fall of 2020, CLA has reached 30,000 leaders from across 800 organizations. Ankur is also the author of the 2020 Women in the Workplace Study, a joint research partnership with leanin.org. That covers the experience of women in corporate America. Prior to joining McKinsey, Ankur was the director of MBA admissions at the Wharton School, and during her tenure there, Wharton was the first top-ranked business school to achieve and sustain 40% plus women representation. Ankur started her career in technology investing, strategy consulting, and global talent development. And she's also featured in The Internet of Women, Accelerating Culture Change. So we are delighted to have someone with such expertise on this topic. So before we dig into the questions, Ankur, I think it's helpful to just frame a little bit this topic. One of the things that we have found in the results that we've gathered from companies through the Gender Ideal Assessment and the Ideal 12 is that a lot of organizations have started to take steps to think about how to run unbiased, inclusive recruitment processes, right? So they're really focused on bringing in an inclusive and building out an inclusive workforce. But a concerning factor in the data that we have found is that very fewer than 25% of those same respondents have done anything yet, have taken any steps to think about how they are creating unbiased performance review processes and whether and how they are tracking promotions inside of their organizations. And so with that context in mind, we felt this was a really important conversation to have. So what I'd love to do is just to start off by talking about something that you all coined in your McKinsey Lean In surveys called the broken rung problem. So can you tell us what that is and how you've seen that show up in data?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Flory, and to everyone who's joining today. I must acknowledge my voice is a little raspier than usual as I'm not feeling the best. So apologies in advance. I'll definitely try to go on mute if I end up coughing, but such an important topic, and couldn't miss the chance to have a chance to talk about it and learn together. So diving in, Flory, and I appreciate the context and the framing that you set, and must celebrate also really just the incredible focus or increased focus that we've seen of organizations, and really being even more thoughtful around how they can diversify recruitment. It's something that has just in the last few years had really been a focus at the other end of the pipeline, looking at more senior level roles. And we're seeing that certainly be ported over to look earlier in the pipeline at earlier roles. And as you mentioned, importantly, that is a critical part of the path forward, but not sufficient in and of itself. So continuing to ensure that you are providing those leaders, whether women, folks of color, or those at the intersection, with the continued support and sort of surround sound, as I may call it, to ensure that they are set up for success in their roles and in their trajectory is critical, as is ensuring that the surround sound of processes, whether performance management, continuing to evolve your culture of inclusion, are also incredibly, incredibly important. So again, really delighted to have a chance to dive in to some of those other areas today. With all that being said, I'm very happy to sort of define or just describe a bit around the broken ladder syndrome. So just as context, and I know we'll share the link to this as part of the follow-up, but each year McKinsey and LinkedIn, for the last 7 years, I should say, that we've conducted a joint research study looking at the state of corporate women in North America. And as part of that, we've looked at the pipeline. So looking at the representation of women and of women of color and of people of color from that entry level to, C-suite or board level roles. And the broken ladder term really refers to the fact that what we see is that women are not being promoted at the same rate as men in that first step up from entry level to manager level. And so what that does is that has implications, of course, in terms of representation and opportunity for women further down the pipeline. And of course, it's hard to make up that gap as you advance as well. So just to put some numbers to this, if we look at our most recent report, which was published last year, we found that for every 100 men who were promoted, again, from that entry level to first manager level role, only 86 women, rather, were promoted. So there was that disparity. We also look at the experience of women of color in particular. And actually last year, for the first time in our 7 years of doing this research, we actually saw that women of color were promoted at roughly the same rate as women overall. So 85 women of color were promoted for every 100 men. And that actually was an increase year over year. In 2020, when we did the same report and the same analysis, we saw that it was only 79 women of color for every 100 of men. So certainly, seen some progress and movement, but it's going to be critical to focus on moving that needle and truly making those promotion rates equitable.
Wow. Those stats are disturbing because we know that women now are graduating with college degrees at a slightly higher rate than men.
Yep.
And so they're entering the workforce, with the same or more training and background, stronger backgrounds even. So to see so quickly the kind of promotion paths diverge is striking. And I don't think we have to spend a whole lot of time talking about why that's harmful for women who aren't getting those promotions. But I'd love to talk a little bit about why is this harmful for business? Like, why should organizations feel motivated to be addressing this issue?
So our research shows, we actually have a series called Diversity Matters, also conducted by some of my McKinsey colleagues. And we actually, through that research, have demonstrated the real financial impact from organizations who have more gender and racial or ethnic diversity. So there's actually real bottom line impact of focusing on and continuing to sort of bring that equity, whether again around gender or race or ethnicity, into your organization. And then of course there's other real impact. So when folks, as we know, at the heart of innovation is the chance to really bring together diverse thinking and diverse perspectives. So we come to better decisions. We come to more creative solutions when we have that diversity of thought and perspective and experience. So that's also a very real, business impact and opportunity as well. And we also see that when folks are in organizations where they feel like they're able to bring their whole selves, to bring aspects of their unique personality and experiences and truly be able to do that in a safe way, then they want to stay at their organizations, right? That's real impact in terms of not only their retention, but also their willingness and desire to recommend their place of work to others as well. So there's a few of the examples, in terms of some of the real quantifiable business impact and, sort of why, to your point, focusing on diversity is certainly something that is important, right? And is the right thing to do, but also has real meaningful impact in terms of organizational success.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you highlighting the real economic value in investing in this work. I do think that that's a compelling business case, or should be for most organizations. So let's get into then the real detail, the nuts and bolts of how organizations can start to break this broken rung cycle. What are some of the first steps an organization should take? I guess, really, how does an organization know? I mean, I think most people say, yeah, no, we don't. Well, we're not tracking it through data, but we are unbiased in how we promote, right? I think that's like a natural instinct. We want to assume that we're not. So, how should a company start to unpack this issue and start to solve it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, one of our core firm values is around assuming positive intent. So I always like to assume that that positive intention is there, but translating that intention into action, right, is often where we see that disconnect in our research and as humans. So a few things, that we've seen as we've looked at organizations now, who've been consistently participating in our survey. So we've now seen over the years, those pull ahead and have had a chance to really explore with those who are ahead of the pack, what some of those best practices have been that have led to their success. One is certainly around tracking the data, to your point, and making sure that there's a shared understanding of your representation by gender, but also race and ethnicity. This intersectional lens, is incredibly important. And that's important both to know from where you're starting, but also to help you set realistic aspirations for where you'd like to, move to, and then also importantly measure, right, how that progress is happening, or if it's not. And if it's not, it gives you a chance to then go back and dissect and understand, where it isn't and where you need to focus. But similarly, also it allows you then to look at where things may be working, right, and what are some of the bright spots, whether that's in, a particular part of your business or a particular geography, and also be able to then do some of that deep diving to understand what's working well, or what are some of those best practices that you would like to, port over from one part of your business to another, to help cascade that, that positive progress as well. So I think certainly that tracking, and then also that continual looking back at and doing the deep dives on, again, pockets of bright spots and also places where there's greater inequity is going to be important to help you understand where to focus.
Mhm.
A second thing is absolutely around holding senior leaders accountable. Our research shows, right, CEOs who truly not just talk the talk, but walk the walk on this is critical to truly moving the needle in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And similarly, we know, right, holding senior leaders accountable for progress on diversity metrics and goals, using things like financial incentives or perhaps even penalties is critical, right? As with all other part of business, we know that what gets recognized and rewarded gets done. And so DEI and approaching DEI in the same way you would any other critical part of your business, and therefore recognizing and rewarding accordingly is important. An interesting note here, actually, Flory, in terms of what we saw in last year's research as well, is that women leaders, again, we had this hypothesis and we saw it bear out, in the data last year as well, which was women leaders have really been stepping up and leaning in more and spending time on DEI, even if it was outside of their core business role.
Mhm.
And what we also see is that women of color, LGBTQ women, women with disabilities are leaning in even more disproportionately than their male counterparts or women overall. And so part of this is certainly around how do you continue to bring majority leaders, men, right, into the equation to also help really lead these important DEI initiatives as well.
Yeah.
You mentioned the bias training. I think this is absolutely part and parcel of what's critical to ensure that your, internal processes, whether for, ongoing performance review or advancement or external hiring, right, remain unbiased. But it's also important to look at that postmortem, right? Did the results pan out in the way that you expected? Was the balance of representation as you anticipated? And again, if so, that's great, right? What are some of the best practices that you want to make sure to cascade, or some lessons? But also it's importantly to do that postmortem so you can say where perhaps it didn't. And again, do that deep dive to understand where and why. And again, help identify and prioritize what are aspects of your hiring process or your evaluation process or your internal promotion process, that are going to be important for you to remedy or adjust accordingly as well. So it's certainly, again, the training is fantastic and critical, but it's really around kind of not just the training alone, but actually the implementation and then the revisiting and understanding, how that has been panning out.
Yeah, that's great.
There's a few other,
Yeah, keep going. I'm noting all of them as you're talking.
I was I'm happy to pause though if there's questions or anything that's helpful to probe on before I share maybe a few other of those leading practices.
Why don't you keep going? Because I think my
Okay.
questions may be relevant for all of them.
Yeah. And again, I think, I'm painting them as individual. Obviously, the power is certainly in having the collective, right? And having, all of these levers, right, being probed and then prioritized, right, based on your organization and what may already be in motion or where there's, an opportunity. I talked a little bit, or you actually should say, Flory mentioned a bit at the top of this call around, ensuring that leaders from diverse backgrounds, whether again women, folks of color, or those at the intersection, are really also being supported in their day to day. And so ensuring that organizations are also providing that important mentorship and sponsorship is critical. And those are actually two distinct things. And mentorship is really kind of the classic, somebody is investing in you and giving you career advice and feedback and the classic, like, let's go to coffee and let me pick your brain, right, as a mentor on what I could be thinking about or doing differently and so on and so forth. Sponsorship is different. Sponsorship is actually having somebody take ownership of your career. Somebody who is acting in a role of a sponsor, as an advocate, they are serving as a champion for you and your organization, helping open doors for new opportunities, pounding the table, and speaking positively on your behalf when you're not in the room. And that is a different investment and role that is critical. And quite frankly, we see that for folks of color, for women leaders, that they are often under-sponsored, right? They may be under-mentored in some cases, or in many cases, when we think about women, they're often over-mentored, but they're under-sponsored. And so ensuring that you are, as an organization, being thoughtful about providing that sponsorship to your leaders is critical. And it's certainly also around educating your sponsors around that role. So as part of my Connected Leaders Academy work, we have the privilege to work with, hundreds of organizations who are invested in supporting the acceleration of their diverse leaders talent pipeline. And by design, we've incorporated a sponsorship into the programming. And one thing we find is this is a new term. This is a new area of focus and awareness for some folks, where they're very familiar with being a mentor or being a player coach, or being a director. It's also a new learning curve and a new way of operating for sponsors as well. So for organizations, it's important to also emphasize and invest in education for both the sponsors as well as for the leaders that they're sponsoring as well. And again, one flag I would say here is we saw from our research that, women and senior women in particular are disproportionately taking on that role of sponsor for women and women of color. In fact, as often as 2.5 times more than for men. So again, a really powerful opportunity to think about how to bring in men or other allies and majority leaders into that conversation.
So interesting. And so on that last mentor, it's interesting because I feel like I read most frequently about mentorship programs and allyship in the workplace. And I feel like I've heard there's less discussion around sponsorship. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly, which is, I think you're advocating for the organization to say, yes, we may already have a mentorship program in place, and now we are going to launch a sponsorship program. So being very explicit about it, and being explicit about the role of that sponsor on behalf of the staff member that they've sponsored. Is that right? I mean, is this something you see happening organically or with intention at the organization level?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely in the sense that all of these roles and ways of support are critical. So mentorship, sponsorship, and certainly allyship are all different and complementary. So having organizations invest in all three of those is critical as well. And as you noted, we tend to see more of focus and understanding of mentorship, and I think growing in terms of allyship, with sponsorship being, sort of, I think, a newer area of focus and structure. as part of, as part of the realm of supporting folks. And you mentioned sort of the organic nature. I think with sponsorship in particular, I think we all have this sort of Cinderella hope that we will, I guess back in the old days, at a in-person networking event at your organization, or, in walking down the hall to the water cooler, that will just strike up a discussion with somebody, and click and connect, and that will magically translate into this wonderful sponsor relationship. It doesn't quite work like that. And so it's often, being even more structured and precise in the pairing that leads to the magic. And part of why that's also important is because we know that we all have a version of similarity bias, right? We tend to seek out people who look like us, with whom we share certain aspects of identity. And so, in that construct, as somebody who is in a diverse leader, again, whether a woman, a person of color, or certainly at the intersection of both, you will get left behind, right? Because there may not be many senior leaders who look like you. And so it's really critical for organizations to be a part of helping to structure those pairings. And importantly, again, this is where the intention and action piece, the connection point is critical. It's important to also continue to check in with both sponsors and the folks that they're sponsoring, to ensure that, one, there's clarity on what their roles and expectations are, and two, to make sure that things are happening. Again, assuming positive intent, but knowing that everybody's busy. Folks may have different understandings of those roles. It's, not uncommon for sometimes there needs to be a little bit of that, sort of injecting of data around what's not working or what could work better to help those relationships as well. So I think that kind of measurement, that kind of, sort of continual checking in as well on how those relationships are going, is also a critical part of ensuring sponsorship in particular is set up for success.
Yeah. Well, and to connect this topic of sponsorship back to one of your earlier points, which was around senior leadership accountability and recognizing traditionally it is men and white men who are the folks who have held power. This is a great opportunity to say, here's a specific program that we would like you as the senior leadership in our organization to be involved in, and here are what the metrics of success look like for a sponsorship program, and to get that group involved in
Yeah,
this type of
absolutely.
work.
And I should say, just reflecting on the Connected Leaders Academy experience, where again, we've now had the privilege to engage, 30,000 leaders from 800 organizations, and therefore have lots of conversations around sponsorship. We absolutely see that organizations are leaning in and really investing the senior leadership mind share and time, to do this. But it is a learning curve, right? It's a learning curve for the sponsors. It's a different, muscle or skill set than they may have exercised previously. And so, definitely, just I flag this because I think, while there's been, and as there should continue to be, a lot of focus on providing greater access to diverse leaders around certain tools and learning, there needs to continue to be, that same level of focus and support for those who are now stepping into new roles and whose intention is very positive, but they may not know what they don't know. And actually, we saw this play out with allyship, which I know you'll have a whole session on, so we won't have to talk about too in depth. But just as a quick flag on this, we actually saw on our research that nearly 3/4 of white employees self-identified as allies in their organizations, right? That intention is there. But when we looked at the actions that they were taking, there was actually a disconnect with what women and women of color in particular were saying that they needed. So it wasn't that folks didn't identify and have the intention to be an ally and weren't doing, important steps in that direction, but there was a disconnect in terms of the areas that they were focusing on and prioritizing, which women and women of color would flag as, hey, I need you to help advocate for me to get a new opportunity, or, to be a part of, stepping in if you're seeing, discrimination happen real time, and help confront and address those issues. And again, it wasn't that those things weren't necessarily happening, but they weren't happening at the level, that women and women of color in particular needed. So again, I think that's, an example of this intention and sort of action disconnect, or really, again, an opportunity, to build awareness about what's really truly meaningful and important for folks.
Yeah. Um, that's a great, a great example. Um, I want to go back to an earlier the earlier comment that you made around tracking data and promotion data. And I'm just curious, as if someone is thinking about, yes, how could our organization do this? Is that a process that you would say should live on the HR or people team, that they should own that, but that they are then like engaging with all people managers in tracking the results and giving that feedback, or are there other people that need to be involved or leading on that work?
Yeah, that's a great flag. I think ensuring that there is that transparency and sharing out of that data with people managers, hiring managers, leaders of different parts of the business is critical. Again, in the spirit of really understanding your talent population and landscape, and being able to then, be grounded in the data so that you can, you know, identify what is, your aspiration, or again, identify, celebrate, and learn from pockets of bright spots, is critical. And really, I think in the spirit of making this a, shared priority for all leaders, right? Sharing that information and really grounding folks in it, is a critical part of that.
Great. Okay, that's really helpful. Um, a question, and this may be a little tricky because I know McKinsey tends to work with larger corporations, but a lot of the companies that are using our tools and are thinking about how to begin doing this work are smaller organizations. So, imagine a company that has maybe about 100 employees. And is there any advice or specific recommendations or sequencing of this type of work that you would recommend for a smaller organization that might say, gosh, we just don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the resources or the team size to do all of these things, but how can we start? How can we kind of know we're moving in the right direction?
Yeah, a few thoughts on that. I think one, prioritization is critical for all organizations, full stop. Quite frankly and candidly, we all have more opportunity on this arena. And, being thoughtful around what's really going to move the needle quickly, and, where to focus is imperative, versus saying, let's throw a bunch up against the wall and, launch a bunch of initiatives, but then we actually don't have the resources to track, or we actually can't, do all as well as we would like, because we're so, our resources are being pulled in so many directions. So I do think prioritization is critical, full stop. I think, again, as you've heard me say multiple times, so I won't belabor it too much, but I do think that understanding your population and tracking your talent, your talent representation is critical, again, to helping you really to really being a part of, I should say, that prioritization exercise. And one might even posit that exercise may be even a little easier in a smaller organization than a larger one.
Mhm.
So certainly maybe a benefit, so to speak. I think similarly, with a smaller organization, I think all of the examples that, or not just examples, but all of those sort of key priorities that I mentioned from leading organizations certainly translate. Again, thinking about perhaps some of the opportunity as a smaller organization, maybe quite frankly easier to quickly pilot, right? To move quickly, actually, in terms of trying out things, rolling out a bias training with, a few folks in one part of your organization before, rolling it out more broadly. The sponsorship pairings, right? Being thoughtful around that, may also be easier because you probably have everybody's names at the top of your list, or, in your head. And so it may be even a, quite an easier, an easier opportunity to start, as a smaller organization around some of these things as well.
Um, Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ankur. I know, especially on a day like today when you're feeling a little under the weather, we're grateful for your time, your wisdom. It's a real pleasure to have someone who's at the forefront of thinking about how organizations are implementing these types of policies and practices into their structures. So I just want to say thank you, and encourage everyone to join us next week for a session on eliminating forced arbitration and the use of non-disclosure agreements in instances of sexual discrimination and harassment. We're going to be joined by Jen Liu, who's been working at the front of that effort for a while. But thank you, Ankur. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Flory, and to everyone who joined. Really, really appreciate the opportunity to have this important dialogue.